Hi, we're excited to pick back up for part two of our breast cancer conversation with Claire Saxton and Dr. Lanasa. So tell me about how does breast cancer research benefit kind of other areas of healthcare and medical science?
So I think breast cancer research really has been the trendsetter in a lot of ways for broader treatment paradigms within oncology. Having just talked about the HER2 experience,
Mhm.
that was one of the first protein biologics for cancer. And again, it was absolutely transformative in its impact for women who had HER2 positive disease. The endocrine suppression therapies have had benefits for other hormone sensitive tumor types, such as endometrial cancer. One of the other paradigm shifting things that has happened in where breast cancer led the way was the idea of doing genetic testing on an individual patient's tumor to identify patients who actually don't have to get chemotherapy, that they're not likely to benefit from chemotherapy. So I think it's the breast cancer community that has really led the drive for de-intensification of therapy to only give as much therapy as necessary to maximize the likelihood of a positive outcome for that patient.
Right? That kind of biomarker testing where before, in 1998, when I started in breast cancer, the doctor would say, okay, we know that this will help extend on average your life this much. But really, what it's doing is it's extending, I don't know, 30% of people's
Yeah.
lives that much.
Yeah.
And so the average is extended that much. If we figure out which are those 30% that will benefit from
Yeah.
that, then 70% don't have to have all of those side effects with none of the benefit.
Wow.
And so breast cancer really has led the way in looking at what are those biomarkers that really show who will benefit from this and how do we, uh, you know, make that cancer stop growing and spreading. And we've seen things like HER2 inhibitors that started in breast cancer now being used in GI cancers and in gynecological cancers. And you're seeing PARP inhibitors being started in breast cancer research and now being used very extensively in ovarian and other gynecological cancers. And so as cancer treatment moves more to looking at those biomarkers that help to um, figure out how your cancer is growing and spreading and target those specific biological processes, we're seeing it matter. Not do you have breast cancer or ovarian cancer or stomach cancer, but do you have HER2 positive cancer? Is your, did your cancer have a BRCA mutation in it, whether it was inherited or not? Those things help drive what are the best treatments. And that's one way that breast cancer research helps all kinds of cancers.
All right. So for limited funding for medical research, can we talk about how we decide what resources are allocated? And let's talk about why breast cancer should remain a priority.
Again, I think it comes back to the epidemiology that it's such a important public health problem because it remains one of the most frequent types of cancer and is the most frequent type of cancer among women. We just talked about how the biologic understanding of breast cancer has led more broadly to advances in oncology care and other solid tumor types as well. Because it's a more common tumor type, it's a bit easier to understand the impact of these types of interventions more quickly, which can then be generalized to other tumor types.
So, what are some of the economic or societal costs of breast cancer that might be immediately obvious? So, thinking about medical costs, emotional support, those type of things.
Sure. I mean, here in the US, we see that people with cancer are much more likely to have financial problems. They're more likely to declare bankruptcy. Um, we hear from patients and caregivers all the time that their family has used some of their retirement funds, that
Mm.
that we even sometimes hear people scrimp on their medications. And so there's a huge financial implications of living with cancer in the US. That's one big thing that is an individual and a family thing, but also becomes a societal thing. We also see, think about all of the missed work or early retirements or disability, people going out on disability. Think about, as people get sicker, their caregivers needing family and medical leave, and needing to be there to help patients get to appointments, to be there for emotional support. The costs add up into the hundreds of millions of dollars every year in terms of the effect on our economy. And the when you hear the individual stories, or at Cancer Support Community, our psychosocial researchers see the actual impact of the distress on people's emotional health, but also on their physical health. Caregivers physically end up less healthy than they were before they started caregiving, because it's, your emotional and your physical health are
Taking a
intertwined.
toll on them, yeah.
And caregivers are much less likely to get their regular screening.
Yeah.
They're much less likely to take care of themselves because they're putting their efforts into taking care of their person who's sick.
Yeah.
And so it's an enormous burden on individuals, on families, but then also society-wide.
Mark, this question is for you. What are some of the most exciting new developments in breast cancer research, and how close do you think they are to becoming more widely available treatments?
There's a number of new targets that are being advanced in breast cancer right now. So I mentioned previously the addition of the CDK4/6 inhibitors, which have had such a big impact, the addition of immunotherapy, which is having a big impact in triple negative subgroup and may also have benefit in the hormone receptor positive subgroup. The application of ADCs in breast cancer. It turns out today there's an ADC for almost every patient across those three subgroups of breast cancer. From there, the targeted therapies, the oral small molecule targeted therapies, we are working very hard on developing a CDK4 selective molecule, which we think could be better than what's currently available in the CDK4/6 inhibitors. That's a tall mountain to climb because the CDK4/6 inhibitors have had such an important impact to patients. There are other targets that we're working on, such as BCL2 and CDK2, that are biologically important in breast cancer. So we're trying to show that modification of those targets can be clinically relevant.
And one of the things that I've seen since 1998 really is things that would have been thought of as science fiction in 1998. You talk about ADCs. Well, that's basically, you have something that is a seeker of the cancer cell, and it is attached. One molecule of chemo is attached to it, or something else that will kill that cancer cell. And so you're going in molecule by molecule and saying, this molecule is attached to this cancer cell.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole idea of that happening in 1998
Yeah.
would have been, that'll never happen. You just have to give chemo systemically. And so it goes to your hair follicles and your hair falls out, and it goes everywhere in your body, and you're nauseous and you're sick. And so, some of the, and how much hope all of these new breakthroughs bring to everyone who's had cancer, has heard that they're cured, but are always worried that it's going to come back, or who are living with cancer, either in active treatment with early stage or living with metastatic cancer where they'll never not be in treatment. The amount of hope that comes from these treatments is amazing.
Yeah.
And just to echo that point, I think the technology is so important. Again, going back to the bone marrow transplant example, well, we knew chemo worked, so let's just give the patient more chemotherapy. Let's intensify in that way. Well, that didn't work. That just made people sicker. now what we're saying is, actually, let's just give more chemotherapy to the cancer rather than to the patient. We're delivering it in a much, much more specific way directly to the cancer. And that has been a very effective way of having intensification of the chemotherapy effect. Ultimately, it is still giving chemotherapy. It's going to induce the same type of chemotherapy resistance patterns. So all these other non-chemotherapeutic targeted therapies are going to absolutely play an increasingly important role in the long-term management of disease.
And the difference between what we knew in 1998 about the biology of cancer in general and breast cancer in specific and the knowledge today has just been exponential.
Yeah.
And in fact, the amount of innovation that we've seen in breast cancer means that more and more it's actually better for patients if they go to a breast cancer specialist, because it's just so hard to keep up with all of the new treatments and make sure that you know what is standard of care now, because it's different from what it was 6 months ago.
So, how has public awareness impacted breast cancer research, and does this translate into more funding for better treatment options?
I think the answer to that question is yes. I think what you see is perhaps philosophically mass action. When you see tens of thousands of people and patients running in a Komen event, people take notice of that.
Yeah.
I think that that has real effect on um, the people who are making funding decisions in our governments, that are deciding how to allocate resources across a number of different worthy areas. And breast cancer research, I think, ultimately is viewed as a highly, highly important area of public health research. And the mass action that the public has taken to support that, I think, has been very, very impactful.
Right. I mean, when you look at a Komen event with 10,000 people there, part of what they're raising money for is research. When you look at, I mean, and if you look back to the 80s and the breast cancer patient advocacy that happened when Star Wars, Reagan's Star Wars missile program was ending, breast cancer advocates said, "Oh, you have extra money, you have extra millions
use
of
it."
dollars left there. Let's use that for cancer research. Let's use that for breast cancer
Yeah.
research." And that was the beginning of a program that now funds all kinds of different cancers. And breast cancer advocates have just kind of been on the cutting edge of how do we know that it's going to take huge investments for us to understand this complex disease and how to treat it, um, and a lot of other cancer advocates have kind of used breast cancer as examples, and aspire to get to the funding levels of breast
Yeah.
cancer.
And that funding, importantly, is having an impact. Sometimes it might feel like it takes a little longer than we would like, but definitively, it is through our understanding of the biology of the disease that we have been able to develop newer, more effective therapies. There's reasons as technologies improve, whether that's DNA sequencing being more widely available and cheaper, other advanced molecular techniques, that there could be further acceleration that could reduce the lead time to seeing new medicines entering the clinic. But it all starts with an understanding of the biology. But we need to understand the biology of the disease to figure out how to treat it better.
And what role do technical advancements play in breast cancer research, and what are some of the promising tools that are being looked at today?
Yes. So there have been a number of technological advancements. When I was a graduate student, I was pouring my own gels to sequence, a couple hundred bases of DNA, and now it's broadly affordable to
Yeah.
do whole genome or whole exome sequencing. There have been similar advances in understanding RNA expression and understanding protein expression, and having this ability to, in a more agnostic way, understand holistically what's happening in a deregulated cancer cell. Again, it's giving us huge insight into the biology. Now we're able to sequence individual cancer cells, single cells. It went from, can we sequence a gene to a patient to a block of tumor, and now it's just down to a single cell.
That's
So that
amazing.
the technology continues to accelerate, and again, we derive dividends in terms of our understanding and benefit to patients.
Yeah, I mean, it really is incredible how technology has made changes. 30 years ago, pathologists were looking under a microscope
Mhm.
and staining things to see, is HER2 protein overexpressed? Do we see these particular in a stain? Can we see it under a microscope? And now it really is. We are looking at the actual DNA sequence. Is there a genetic mutation there in that one cell's DNA?
Yeah.
And what kinds of mutations are found help understand what makes that cancer grow and spread. And so, what's the right treatment to keep that from growing and spreading?
Do you have anything that you could say to kind of patients and families that are going through breast cancer or that could be going through breast cancer in the future? Something that's kind of reassuring for them what's coming up in kind of in a research capacity?
What I like to tell patients is we're in this fight with them. Definitively.
Yeah.
We have a whole team of people across multiple different functions, and every day they come to work and they're committed to improving outcomes for patients with breast cancer. Just letting them know we care and absolutely that we are working on it. From there, there's a current standard of care, and we believe we're going to be able to advance that standard of care through clinical trials and investigation of novel targets. I am personally a big advocate and encourage people to participate in clinical trials
Yeah.
when they can. It always humbled me when I was a provider. I would estimate probably 80% of my patients who enrolled in a clinical trial would express some sort of notion of altruism that I don't know that this is going to help me, but I want to do it because it might help somebody else.
Yes.
Right. So that was just a beautiful and really touching thing to me. But again, we are here. We are in this fight with you. We want you to do better. And we think that we have emerging tools in the toolbox that will help with that.
Yeah, I've interviewed some patients over the past year and a half or so, and all of them some of them gone to clinical trials, and they're here because of the clinical trials. It's so amazing, and they're all advocates for it.
And when you talk to almost everybody I've talked to who's been in a clinical trial, went into it thinking, okay, I'll be a number
Yeah.
in this study, and came out of it going, they saw me more often. I got
Yes.
more scans. I
Thanks,
really
care.
got to know the care team. I got to know the research team. They knew who I was. They kept track of me. I really felt like I got better, more personalized care. And so, one of the things that we do at Cancer Support Community is we have a peer support program for anybody who's considering being part of a clinical trial. You can talk to somebody who's been in a
That's
clinical
amazing.
trial. We'll connect you to if you're African American, somebody who's African American. If you are Spanish speaking, somebody who's Spanish speaking, so that you can hear from somebody who's been there and who has had similar experiences in the healthcare system as you have. What was it like to be part of a clinical trial?
There's actually data on this point that patients who participate in a clinical trial overall have better outcomes.
Mhm.
Now, that's not necessarily because the medicine that they're receiving in the clinical trial is giving them more of a benefit, but rather they're being seen more often, they're being seen by more people, they're having more tests run, which is burdensome to the patient, but there's just a lot more information for their provider to make decisions and be really on top of things. And that probably ultimately does lead to better outcomes.
And Claire, for when a patient goes into a clinical trial, obviously they're thinking about, is this going to help me? But do they also ever think about, do you ever hear feedback about, wow, think about all the other patients I could be helping?
Absolutely. And in fact, in our Justified Medical Mistrust video series, we interview African Americans and Blacks who talk about how I didn't do this for me. I
Mhm.
did this to make sure that my community knows that these treatments will work for them and that they're safe for them. Because if I don't participate and the rest of my community doesn't
Yes.
participate, we don't know the answers to that.
Yeah.
And so, definitely, there's a lot of altruism that goes into clinical trial.
Mhm.
There's also some people who are, very interested in, well, what is the newest, the latest? Can I get it
Yes.
first to participate in a clinical trial? And then, frankly, there are other people who kind of feel like it they don't have other good options. And so that's why they participate in a clinical trial. But there are lots of reasons for participating in a clinical trial, and you can get good treatment in a clinical trial. Most cancer clinical trials don't include placebos. And so, because the first thing people think about is, oh, I'll get a sugar pill instead of treatment. That doesn't happen in cancer clinical trials unless at that stage and moment in your cancer treatment, the standard of care would be to not give you treatment.
Okay.
That is the only reason that you would get just a placebo and no treatment.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this over and over and over about how well treated they are whenever they're going into a clinical trial. So it just sounds like it's completely next level, which is amazing. So,
Yeah.
are there any misconceptions about breast cancer research or treatment that either of you would like to address?
So I guess I would like to dig in a little bit to justified medical mistrust, because there are historical reasons that people of color and people who are historically underserved have not been served well by research. And, people still today run into racism and classism in the healthcare system. And so there are reasons for people to be mistrustful. And so one of the things that healthcare providers, that researchers, that patient advocates need to do is to really educate and show how things have changed and why it is safe for you, and all of the safeguards that are there for you if you're part of a clinical trial, because there is every reason for people to think they don't have my best interests at heart, because historically we can point to multiple cases in multiple different populations where the researchers didn't have their best interests at heart.
I think that this is such an important piece, and it's well recognized at this point that minorities and individuals from lower socioeconomic groups are consistently underrepresented in clinical trials. And there's been a real call to action by the FDA, which we agree with and we applaud in this regard. I think there's really two facets to it from there. So one is simply the social equity piece, right? So shouldn't clinical trials be available to all patients? And I want to be clear that we are not making a claim of efficacy for any clinical trial. Some clinical trials ultimately will lead to new medicines, and patients who participate in those studies might derive benefit, but many clinical trials are not successful. Nevertheless, they advance the field overall. And again, there's the benefits in terms of the level of care that patients receive. While that distrust is justified, now the concern is it becomes a barrier to participation. So we want to overcome this piece and ensure that there is social equity, but that there's also a real technical concern of making sure that drugs provide the same magnitude of benefit across relevant subgroups of patients. So when a future woman of color is seen by her provider, that provider can have confidence that this new medicine is going to bring her the same level of benefit and the same side effect profile as it says on the product label.
And if there was one area within breast cancer research you think should receive immediate funding, what would it be and why? Can I start with you, Claire?
One is hard because inflammatory breast cancer needs more research and more treatments. Triple negative breast cancer needs more research and more treatments. Metastatic breast cancer needs more research and more treatment, especially metastasis to the brain, because getting through that blood-brain barrier is so difficult and it's so hard to treat. So I can't choose just one, but I know that there are huge gaps in the ability for people to have treatment that will either be able to have their doctor say, you are cancer free, or be able to have somebody live with chronic treatment, but a good quality of life for multiple years.
Okay.
And the hope is that we get so that anybody diagnosed with breast cancer has one of those two options?
I think that there's still a need in terms of early detection. My understanding is that the majority of women who are dying from breast cancer today are women who were diagnosed with early stage breast cancer and were told that they likely had low risk disease. Numerically, that's such a large subgroup of patients that because 20 to 30% of those women ultimately will have metastatic progression and unfortunately will ultimately die from their disease, that remains the largest subgroup of patients who are dying from breast cancer. So I don't know exactly what that looks like. Does that mean better imaging, using better imaging techniques, functional imaging techniques? How do we improve upon mammography? And then there's a promise of blood-based testing. This is something people have been talking about for decades of, can we detect cancer in the bloodstream before it's even visible on an X-ray or other imaging test? I think that we have the molecular techniques now that we can detect individual pieces, very low levels of DNA that's floating in the bloodstream, but figuring out how to make that more broadly available so we can actually cure more patients and have a lower rate of women who are having metastatic relapse late.
And imagine how many more people would actually get screened if it was just, we need some blood at your annual exam, rather than, okay, now that you've been to your annual exam, here's your prescription to get your mammogram, and now you have to go schedule it, and
It's a whole nother.
a whole nother appointment. And yeah, so certainly the promise of blood-based screening is, something that many patient advocacy groups are very hopeful for, and looking at ways of how could we get something like that actually have the same kind of approval so it gets coverage as a screening test and have a zero copay just like other screening tests.
Yeah. And last question is, how can listeners support breast cancer awareness research beyond just donations? And are there any actions that they can make that they can do to make a real difference?
So there are a number of breast cancer advocates who work specifically in the research space.
Okay.
And I'm thinking of, there's kind of a grassroots group called GRASP that has breast cancer patients and breast cancer advocates go to scientific conferences, learn more about the research, and be able to interact with the researchers on a one-on-one basis in order to help them understand, oh, you found that breast cancer patients have worse quality of sleep. I can tell you, for me, it's because of my hot flashes. And there are a lot of patient advocacy groups that work to train survivors and caregivers and loved ones on some of the basic research so that they can do things like be a patient advocate or a peer reviewer as a patient, and be able to say, well, the government has this much money for breast cancer research, and I'm going to help, not from a scientific point of view, but from a patient point of view, say, now, I don't know that I would fund that research project, because if it means that you have to go in every other day for 3 months, I don't think a lot of people are actually going to join that trial.
Right.
But this trial over here, did you think about doing this? And I think that's both. I hear from a scientist that it's promising, and I also think that that would be a trial that could accrue really quickly because of how it's designed. And so getting in touch with breast cancer advocacy groups can really, if you have an interest in research, there are great trainings that you can help you learn more about the whole process and how to get plugged in to be able to be somebody who, like, cancer support community gets asked all the time, do you know any breast cancer survivors who could give us feedback on this particular clinical trial protocol?
Yeah.
And so when we have people who are trained up and understand kind of the basics, they can go with their patient perspective and say, well, from a patient point of view, did you think about this and this and this? Because I know you're looking at it from the scientific point of view, but if you do these 3 things, it makes it so much harder on patients.
The advocacy groups in breast cancer are well established. They do wonderful work. So I think that there would be opportunities for anyone to participate in their activities. And I think in that way, not only do you educate yourself about the disease, you also come in contact with patients and can understand what their journey and their experience is like. I think that I'm also a big believer in a lot of individuals making small acts can have an outsized impact.
Yeah.
So, through your community, are there patients who don't have adequate caregiver support? Are there ways that you could be in contact with those patients through local schools, through churches, or other social networks where you can help a patient who's going through this terrible experience right now? Can you talk to the people who you know well, whether it's your relatives or again, your close friends and say, have you had your annual examination? Are you doing your screening
Yeah.
testing? Just checking in on the people you care about and the people in our community to help them on their own journey. Maybe it's in screening or maybe it's just in their own broad personal health care.
And Claire, do caregivers is it is there ever any training that a caregiver needs to take? Obviously, they don't know what they're doing. So, do you have caregivers that are teaching other caregivers what to do today?
So we definitely have caregiver support groups
Okay.
so that people can share how they got through something, how they coped. Yes, there are some particular trainings for caregivers at certain points in the, medical system when somebody's coming home from a surgery and needs their drains emptied and things like that. There's some trainings that caregivers will get from healthcare providers, the nurse or the doctor, but a lot of what people need when they're going through cancer is just a recognition of how much this is turning their life upside down.
Yep.
And how much support they and their loved ones need in order to get through it. And, you see all kinds of people coming together with meal trains and help with rides to the doctor and things like that. And so, Cancer Support Community has a whole app so that to make that really easy for caregivers to make sure that they bring in the support of their whole community in supporting that person. And it's not just the one caregiver who feels like they have to do it all.
Yeah. I want to thank you both. This has been a very educational talk, and I learned so much, so I hope our listeners did too. So I want to thank you both for being on the show with us, and thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Be sure to follow us and subscribe to our podcast on Amazon, Spotify, Apple, or iHeart. You can also subscribe to the video version of the podcast on YouTube. Thanks so much.